So, political scientists, welcome to the second part of the lesson. Sorry about the animation trouble there. You'd think I'd check, but it takes so long and I can't edit. And, yeah, going back to the beginning and starting again when I'm trying to get a lesson out doesn't seem like a terribly good idea. So, forgive the two videos. I shall get straight back into it. There aren't any links in the description to the last one. They will be in the one to this one. They'll just be below, down there somewhere. I believe there are also functions, typical YouTuber comments. I don't know any, and I have no theme tune. So, onwards. Let us talk about collective ministerial responsibility. We left the story with Priti Patel and a weird interview on Good Morning, I think it was. It was weird. Well worth a watch. And I hope you did at the end of the last video. Sorry for its abrupt end. So, let's talk about collective ministerial responsibility. We've talked about individual ministerial responsibility. You've got to be across your brief. You've got to know your stuff. You take responsibility for anything your department does. That means blame as well as good things. You resign if there's any failing in your department, even if it wasn't your fault. Furthermore, on a personal level, you distribute. Or if your resignation can spare the government some kind of scrutiny that it would otherwise not want, i.e. Michael Fallon, a bit of an odd one. So, but still, very, very powerful. So what's collective ministerial responsibility when it's at home? Well, this is a completely different kettle of fish. And for this, I'm going to have to explain a few things with expectations. The expectation is that Cabinet is secret, it is united, and that it does things as a group. They have a discussion and then they all put their energies behind whatever they've decided. And that expectation means that you've got to maintain the integrity of Cabinet through secrecy. You've got to have a forum where it's safe to say what you think. You've got to have a forum where you're not playing to the crowd. Remember, these are politicians. Everything they say in public will come back to haunt them. Everything. And so, in public, they've got to say things a particular way. So, how can I put this? If you've got a series of support in public, you will say, oh, of course, I'll look into that particular thing. Privately, you've got to be able to say, look, I've looked into it and it's not going to work. Please help me out here. So that you can maintain your popularity. Cabinet is supposed to be a place where politicians can say that sort of thing. High-powered politicians, the ones the media are following. And it therefore follows that if you make an argument in Cabinet, it's private, it's secret. And so the expectation is that in public you all agree with Cabinet decisions, so that in private, in Cabinet meetings, you can say whatever you want. Furthermore, it augments prime ministerial authority if, as a Cabinet member, you follow the Cabinet rule. Furthermore, Cabinet members can force prime ministerial hands by resignation if they so wish, or by leaking what they've said in Cabinet, and then, I guess, running the risk of being forced to resign. Let's take, for an example, Peter Thornycroft, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1958. He was worried that the then Conservative government was the victim of excessive public spending. Too much money was being spent by government with too little coming in the way of taxes. Now, it's worth pointing out, and this is an unexpected thing, historically speaking, Conservative governments spend more and rack up higher debts than Labour governments, which is a weird way of looking at it. Labour governments tend to spend less as a percentage of GDP, or where they spend equal amounts to Conservative governments in terms of GDP, they tend not to get into so much debt. Now, there's many ways you can see about that, but that is the truth. It's not what people expect, but it's actually backed up by evidence. So, Peter Thornycroft saying there's a bit of a problem with Conservative finances is a bit of a big deal. He resigned from Macmillan's cabinet as he was unable to support the spending plans of that government, and he said this administration cannot possibly afford to spend this money. There were two other ministers, and I'll get their names for you because I haven't written them down, and they are Birch and Powell, who resigned with him. Powell being the famous Enoch Powell. Yes, that one, the Rivers of Blood speech one, the racist one. So, I don't know, make of that what you will. Macmillan dismissed it as little local difficulties in that very Macmillan way he had. And the following year, there was a landslide election victory in 1959, and it suggests that few people cared about this particular one. So that particular attempt to undermine a government didn't really work, or you could argue it was nothing to do with undermining government. It was simply the way things are with collective ministerial responsibility, that you resign if you cannot agree with a cabinet decision. Peter Thornycroft disappears off into history and never returns, as far as I'm aware, to government really. Not in a way that we have to worry about him. The next one, those boxes are not even. The next one is Geoffrey Howe. Now, Geoffrey Howe was the then Leader of the House and Deputy Prime Minister in 1990. And he resigned over, how to put this, Europe and sundry issues. His resignation speech, the top of those two links, is all about Europe and was described by Andrew Marr in a phrase I wish I'd found out and used first, but it's Andrew Marr, as he didn't stab Thatcher in the back. He stood up in the middle of Parliament and stabbed her repeatedly in the front. It's worth watching that first video clip, the top one, at the bottom there, of him giving his speech. It's about 14 minutes in length, and he gives his statement about why he's resigning. The quality ain't great, and I apologise, but it is watchable. And pay attention to his reasoning given. He said he resigned from Thatcher's cabinet because of rising Euroscepticism, and this follows her famous no, no, no speech. Seriously, look up Thatcher no, no, no and speech in YouTube. You'll find what I'm talking about if you're interested. I have not included a link in the PowerPoint. But there we go. This was then reported at the time and had an effect. The bottom link, by the way, is a link to the film Thatcher the Iron Lady, which is interesting. It's all taken from the point of view of Thatcher being a bit senile. Thatcher isn't, by the way, and having Parkinson's, she kind of did towards the end of her life, and viewing it as a lonely old woman remembering things not necessarily the right way or the way in which they happened. What is telling about this particular clip is that it was based on observations of how she treated her cabinet, which we'll come back to later, and Geoffrey Howe's own memoirs about cabinet meetings. You'll notice I had added sundry issues. Howe doesn't really explain these in his resignation speech, but that film clip gives an interesting insight into what they may have been. And certainly there is evidence to suggest that that sort of behaviour in cabinet did occur. Not that particular incident. The filmmakers have very carefully protected themselves against that kind of claim by making it about a woman with Parkinson's rather than about Thatcher, if that makes sense. But I find it instructive and interesting as an example of what may have been going on. So do have a watch. It's only very short, and I find it a fascinating scene. So pause the video now, go watch those video clips, you'll see what I mean. It's this whole idea of Thatcher as a bully, and we will return to that when we're talking about the powers of the Prime Minister and how they control their cabinet. I'll call it how Prime Ministers win and how Prime Ministers lose, which is slightly different to the textbook, but that's good. It gives you two ways of looking at the same thing. So that's that. I just realised I haven't updated my images on the side, and I do apologise. Sometimes, of course, it can backfire quite spectacularly, as it did with Robin Cook in 2003. He was the Leader of the House and was a respected MP at the time. He disagreed with the Blair government's approach to the potential of war in Iraq. There was a sexed-up dossier that suggested that Iraq had 45 minutes' notice and they could produce a military response that would threaten the UK. Have I got his speech? I do. I've got two animations there. I'll talk about those in a moment. He was unconvinced by that dossier, alleging that Iraq posed a threat to UK national security. He said it didn't. And so he resigned in order to support protesters who were saying, you know what, this is a problem. He also managed to create something, and I'll come on to that in a moment. Now, the first clip, you'll notice it starts time 62 seconds in, is a reasonably good quality clip of his resignation speech. It's about 14 minutes in length again. 14 minutes in resignation speeches seem to be common. So do have a watch, but it is 14 minutes long, and it is interesting because he explains very clearly why he is resigning. He was supported at the time by Jeremy Corbyn, among others. Why is this relevant? Well, watch that speech first and then come back here. Okay, I'm going to assume you've watched the speech. What he set out, what he achieved there, was making it clear that Parliament had a role to play when the government declared war. And that is interesting because it's a thing we've talked about already when we were talking about the power of Parliament. You might remember that back in a previous video. I forget exactly which one. And it was during the bombing of Syria when Jeremy Corbyn made a speech saying that Parliament had to be consulted. Now, the second video link underneath there is Jeremy Corbyn quoting Robin Cook, making the statement that Parliament has a role to play. So Robin Cook's initial resignation had little effect on government, as I explained. War in Iraq began later that year, and there was a general election victory to Blair in 2005, suggesting no one really cared. So it didn't really work. However, the effects and reverberations of this particular resignation were, well, they're explained. I'm afraid I've got it from Russia Today, and I do apologise. I couldn't find a high-quality clip of him saying it, otherwise just the bit I wanted. So I apologise about using Russia Today, but at least it's taken from parliamentary footage, even if the graphics going over the top are slightly irritating and diverting at times. But it's worth watching that clip. Does collective ministerial responsibility play a role? And the answer is, well, it's an old one. It's difficult. I couldn't find the audio recording for the next bit, but it shows the potential of what you can do to control your cabinet. If you disagree, then you have to resign. Otherwise, you've got to support the government in public. Here's John Major's take on this and why collect people into the cabinet. That is right, but where do you think most of this poison has come from? It is coming from the dispossessed and the never possessed, i.e. those who are not in cabinet and those who have never been in cabinet. You and I can both think of ex-ministers who are going around causing all sorts of trouble. Would you like 3 more of the bastards out there? He kissed Edwina Curry with that mouth. Anyway, so what this shows, the reason for the quote and the reason the cabinet in an effort to control them, and therefore as a Prime Minister maintain authority over your cabinet and over the direction of government policy. By putting them in cabinet and making them agree with you in public, you can have those arguments and disagreements in private. They, in turn, get your ear and the chance to harangue you in private, which means they're more likely to get what they want, but the flip side is they don't get to complain about you in public as much. Now, that was the normal political times. This sort of thing will return. I'll come back to it in a moment. The next example that I've got is Wilson and dissent in his cabinet. Sometimes when cabinet dissents and disagrees with you in public, it can show up your lack of authority, and that can be politically embarrassing. Now, Wilson's turned up a lot so far. I quite like Wilson. I've got a soft spot for him because he smokes a pipe. I don't smoke. Wilson is the man to follow. Sorry, Wilson is the man to follow. Wrong side of the screen. So what was going on? I've called it UK's relationship with the EEC, and you'll say, so that doesn't match what you've written beneath. Bear with me. So Benn, Hart and Lester were cabinet ministers. That's Tony Benn, not Hilary Benn, his son, who's still in Parliament. And they backed a resolution from the NEC, that's the ruling council of the Labour Party, bear in mind, top-down political system like, say, the Conservatives are. So this is an odd one. The party leader can often be overridden overridden by the NEC and the party membership. And you've seen that in your lifetimes as well, quite recently, in fact, with things, well, with Jeremy Corbyn and his eventual dethroning, and also Keir Starmer and his perennial thorns in the side of people he disagrees with, i.e. Labour Party members. They backed a resolution in public in Labour fronts condemning joint military exercise with South Africa as a gross error. And you're like, okay, how's that got anything to do with the EEC or Wilson? All right, second question first. Labour were in government at the time. It was their decision to send Royal Naval exercises to train with South African military forces. And you're saying, okay, fine, and? South Africa was an apartheid regime and had been isolated by the international community for being, well, horrendous racists and believing that black people should be kept separate from all other people because they're black, you see. And they shouldn't marry with white people because that's bad, you see. And being horrendous racists meant that a lot of people were like, well, we don't agree with this. And giving segregation such a thing, and not just segregation, but deliberate segregation, where black people were maltreated and given the very worst resources and were often starving to death, etc., 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 bad schooling, etc. There's a whole story there. This is a big deal. So, for a British government to agree to military exercises seemed a bit odd. Now, it's also worth pointing out that 1974 was the year of an election. The Labour government had only just taken over. That meant that the planning for this military exercise must have taken place under the previous government that had been a Conservative government. So Wilson had taken the view that he didn't plan it, it was too late to stop it, it was useful for Britain's full training, so he wasn't going to just upend it because the cost it would bring just to upend it and bring all the ships back, etc. That would be difficult. Things were already in train. So he had to, publicly at least, say that there were reasons why they were doing it, even though Labour would have disagreed in opposition. There was nothing they could now do without incurring incredible bills. Having done that, however, he's got a bit of a problem because... sorry, there's someone at the door. He's got a bit of a problem because it's now a government decision. In Cabinet, one assumes a debate had been held. Now that they'd had that debate, in public they've got to support their Prime Minister. By not doing this, they were not supporting their Prime Minister. So this is a big deal. Wilson said of this that it was a decision on your part, speaking to the three Cabinet Ministers, that you did not wish to continue as a member of this administration. He did not like the decision, but he would accept it. In other words, he was inviting them to resign. But they didn't, and no one was sacked. This made him look particularly weak, and may have led to a decision later on in his premiership to allow the Cabinet freedom in public to debate which side of the EEC referendum in 1975 they supported, hence my putting of the relations with the EEC as the reasoning for my explaining this, and we'll come back to it in a little bit more detail later, but you hopefully can see the link and see how one leads to the other, and it explains a disturbing lack of authority if you're Wilson, and may have set the government off on the wrong foot. But then 74 to 79 is a particularly interesting period in political history. Don't worry, you don't need to know too much in detail. We're not a history group, we're a political science group, so this is just there as a reason why collective ministerial responsibility can sometimes fail, and in so doing, make a government look bad. In coalition, collective ministerial responsibility was obviously an agreement. The coalition agreement covered many areas in which both sides, the Lib Dems and the Conservatives, agreed that anyone involved in Cabinet and anyone in their party would not publicly disagree with what had been agreed with in the coalition agreement, meaning that although they'd campaigned on different manifestos and all they had different views on certain things, they'd reached a coalition, they'd reached an agreement on some areas. Some areas were not covered, specifically allowing dissent within Cabinet to come to the head. So they were Trident renewal and the construction of new nuclear power stations as examples of areas where they would discuss in public and disagree with if necessary, because the Lib Dems had campaigned against those things and the Conservatives had campaigned for those things. So not to have some kind of debate about that would have been wrong. So collective ministerial responsibility was specifically suspended, implying that it's still considered as important, even in a coalition government. In particular, there was the AV referendum, in which the Lib Dems campaigned for a switch to AV and the Conservatives campaigned against a switch to AV, despite the fact they were both in government and they had called the referendum. And there was also the bombing of Syria, in which Nick Clegg and the Lib Dems vehemently disagreed with Cameron's view that Syria needed to be bombed in, I want to say 2011 as well, with chemical weapons, but it might have been later. It's probably, no, it's 2014, isn't it? 2014, it's after the 2011 Arab Spring. But you get the idea. These were areas where, very specifically, collective ministerial responsibility was suspended, implying that it's still very important. However, I've added the note that it's an outlier. This is unusual when you're looking at collective ministerial responsibility across time. It's highly odd and unusual to have it suspended in this way. We've only had one coalition government since 1945, and as a consequence, we don't expect to see much of this. So it's worthwhile noting, for an essay on collective ministerial responsibility, you'd use this to explain that it's still important. But beyond that, it's an outlier, it's an odd example. The next example I'm going to talk about is the EU EEC in full. In the 1975 referendum, it was Wilson versus Benn. Wilson's the guy with the pipe. Benn, weirdly, doesn't have a pipe in that image. There is an image with him with a pipe in the mouth, but it was black and white, and frankly, I wanted a colour image. And Wilson was forced to recognise that he lacked the authority over his cabinet to force all of his ministers to agree with his personal view that joining the EEC had been a good thing. As a consequence, he allowed those that disagreed to campaign against voting in favour of the EEC referendum in 19 under Heath, the previous Conservative Prime Minister, and Wilson won the argument that way, if that makes sense. So, in many ways, Wilson's authority was almost solidified by the fallout of that first problem back about the South African joint military engagement. So the EEC almost solidified his authority over cabinet because he was shown to be more in tune with the popular opinion at the time, which is a very powerful thing for a political leader to have. You'll remember when we talked about general elections and the impact leadership can have. Wilson's leadership here was very powerful. In 2016, a similar thing occurred, except that it occurred without the agreement of the Prime Minister. Cameron was beset by the idea that Gove, Failing Grayling, Ian and Duncan Smith, the twins, among others, there were 5 in total, went against his stated aim of campaigning for staying in the EU. And that was a major issue, and these cabinet ministers made it really difficult to have a cabinet decision. Cameron never accepted, in public at least, that it was a divided cabinet, so it was never officially suspension of collective ministerial responsibility, and a chance for people to strike Cameron down. And many Leave voters interviewed after the fact suggested that is exactly why they had voted the way they had done. Now, exactly how many? Estimate. So you can see how the 2016 referendum causes an issue for collective ministerial responsibility because they're arguing against each other in public. There's a radio interview that I remember listening to with Ian and Duncan Smith, both of them turned up, having a pop at Cameron specifically about the conduct of Leave and Remain campaigns in the referendum, which would have just been unheard of. Well, perhaps it wouldn't have been because the EEC referendum in 1975, they specifically suspended it. But it was a bit of an issue, and interesting that it was never officially announced. In 2019, May versus David Davis, and Boris Johnson. They both resigned over an agreement reached at Chequers. Chequers is the retreat, it's the image behind all of this PowerPoint, where the Prime Minister can entertain dignitaries from other countries, but also their own cabinet. In this one, May entertained her own cabinet and got them to agree to a cabinet decision. Boris Johnson therefore provides us with a rather good explanation of what collective ministerial responsibility is. I know, weird. Boris Johnson providing us with an example of responsibility? I know. But that photograph there is the photograph he posed for when he was signing his resignation letter. So this is a very public resignation. The video clip is a news clip explaining his resignation as it was breaking, so before anyone knew he'd posed for pictures, presumably because it was still going on. But here is the extract from his letter. You can find it in the textbook as well. It says, "On Friday I acknowledged that my side of the argument were too few to prevail," whatever that means, grammar errors as seen, "and congratulated you," that's May, "on at least reaching a cabinet decision on the way forward." Oof, backhanded compliments. "As I said then, the government now has a song to sing. The trouble is that I have practiced the words and find that they stick in the throat. We must have collective responsibility. Since I cannot in all conscience champion these proposals, I have sadly concluded that I must go." Poetic turn of phrase. This was, as the news clip explains, news clip, down there, no wait, down there. News clip explains a response to the resignation of David Davis. And that, it's a joke, don't worry about it. And, well, the news clip explains the context quite neatly, and also why this might not be indicative of how important collective ministerial responsibility is to Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, despite the fact that he was using it as a pretext to resign. There was obviously something else going on, and he's using a well-known aspect of government to cover, I suppose, for what he was attempting to do. But it's interesting that he did it that way, and it tells us something about the role of collective ministerial responsibility. Go have a watch of the news report now, pause the video, and come back when you're ready. Okay, I'm going to assume you've been away and watched that news clip. It's well worth a watch. By the end of 2019, you could say that May was pretty much in conflict with everybody. Her entire cabinet was in disarray. Amber Rudd and, was it Gawke? David Gawke? I think it was David Gawke. And, yeah, it was. And Greg Clark all disobeyed a government three-line whip to vote for a no-deal Brexit and in favour of the Benn Amendment, the Benn Act as it later became known. So that implied that collective ministerial responsibility had pretty much broken down. And toward the end of her premiership, it was pretty much dead in the water. The textbook argues optimistically that this, under normal situations, will come back. I've mentioned this before. And that it was highly unusual at the end of 2019. Well, it was. So where are we now? Well, here's the most recent one that I've got. I've got Priti Patel, who has recently gone on record, and I cannot find an interview where she says it, as saying that she told the Conservative Friends of India group during a Zoom call on Tuesday, on should we have closed our borders earlier, the answer is yes. I was an advocate of closing them last March, despite the fact that government discussion on that was that they were not to close. That is a breach of collective ministerial responsibility. Remember I said you can't go out and say, I was the lone voice of reason in that room. I argued one thing and everyone argued against me. Well, that's exactly what Priti Patel is saying in this explanation. Now, the YouTube clip links to, I can't remember, a news report on that, I think. But it's fascinating that in January 2021, she said and done publicly, she clearly hasn't resigned for saying this. This was earlier this month, and so there it is. I got the quote, by the way, the exact quote from a Graniad website, which was very careful not to do libel. So I must assume that quote is reasonably accurate. The word reportedly does a lot of heavy lifting there. So where are we currently with collective example, whether or not in person? I don't know. And you can link it back to individual ministerial responsibility as well. So Priti Patel clearly disagrees with the government decision. Is it right for her to then say in public that she disagreed with that decision? What's next? Will she name who was against her? Will she explain who opposed that view and who eventually won the argument? Could be. There have been leaks. Leaks are pretty common. And you could argue that under collective ministerial responsibility, leaks themselves are an issue. Under Theresa May, it was a regular feature that they were asking staff to hand in their mobile phones to be checked to make sure that they weren't leaking cabinet decisions. When Boris Johnson took over, they actually confiscated the phones of cabinet ministers on the way into cabinet meetings. That's interesting. What does that tell us about the role of collective ministerial responsibility and how strong it is now? Now, the textbook says one thing, but bear in mind the textbook was being updated in 2019, and as a consequence, it cannot cover everything. It was published pretty much mid-2019. It cannot include Boris Johnson as Prime Minister after an election. But it's fascinating. So collective ministerial responsibility is very much a live issue, and I hope this talk through has explained how that works. Now, there's a 10-15 minute video that you've already looked at that should cover maybe half a lesson. This is approximately 30 minutes long, but there are several speeches of around about 14 minutes in there, so I suspect this will take slightly longer than a single lesson, and therefore is a double lesson and a bit. Maybe a double and a half? I don't really know. When combined with the previous video. So this will grow. If you have been, thank you very much for watching. Sorry for splitting it across two videos, the joys of editing. And I shall see you in the next video, and if not then, I will see you on Thursday for a live team.